Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. In this week's podcast, we will treat another New Testament passage. The text is familiar, so familiar that we sometimes neglect the details that are so crucial to interpretation. The text I have in mind is found in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 25, verses 31 through 46. This involves a statement from Jesus about a final judgment in which sheep, ostensibly the good guys, are separated from goats, ostensibly the bad guys. Interpreting this material seems so straightforward. We are in a metaphorical court where a verdict is being rendered. If we have treated people well, we are likely to be acquitted. If we have treated people badly, we are likely to be condemned. It is a chilling passage. Everyone wants to be found innocent. No one wants to be found guilty. Plus, given the behaviors that are being judged, feeding the hungry, giving water to the thirsty, clothing the naked, visiting the imprisoned, welcoming the stranger, this text is often used to advocate for a so-called social gospel. The conclusion is that sheep are involved in a social gospel, while the goats could not care less about the hungry, thirsty, naked, the estranged, or imprisoned. Upon interpreting the text in this manner, it is time to go on to the next passage. But is that a fair assessment of this famous text? Let's take a look at the details to see whether we can provide a little more nuance to this standard reading. This is an apocalyptic, that is, a final revelatory disclosing judgment. This is indicated that this is an apocalyptic, that is, a final revelatory disclosing judgment, is indicated when Jesus notes that it will take place when the Son of Man and all his angels gather for the occasion. That's in verse 31. The Son of Man here refers to a humble figure who was adept at fulfilling God's will and plan, something that is also indicated by the numerous angels or special heavenly messengers accompanying this figure. Sitting on a glorious throne also signals an apocalyptic setting. This is a big deal judgment. This is not a lower court. It is the Supreme Court. The verdict will not be reached by one's peers, but by the Son of Man, accompanied by all these celestial minions. Well, if this is metaphorically a law court of sorts, who are the defendants? Typically, we have interpreted this scene individually. This means each human being who has ever lived has to face his or her Creator to find out whether they are sheep or goats. But according to the text, individuals are not the defendants in this judicial scene. Instead, they are referred to as all the nations. That's in verse 32. These nations are not further specified. Whoever they are, however, they will in this setting be judged in an analogous manner as when an ordinary shepherd separates sheep from goats. Whatever we make of this scene, it is a colossal misjudgment to see this in individualistic terms. This is a collective judgment of nations. Presumably, these are nations that are to be distinguished from Israel, God's elect people. In the process of distinguishing sheep from goats, the sheep selected are to be placed on the right, whereas the goats selected are to be placed on the left. It turns out that the Son of Man a term that reflects humility and ordinariness, now morphs into a royal figure, a king. Verse 34. As the king commences the judging process, he says something extremely positive to the sheep who have been selected out and are at his right. The king pronounces a blessing on the sheep and invites them to take their place in a kingdom that had been prepared for them from the foundation of the world. Well, that is indeed good news. Who would not thrill at receiving such a blessing and invitation? But an immediate question is raised. How did the sheep get to be sheep? Without letting the question linger, the king answers the probing question. Sheep became sheep because of what they did to and for the king. For the king went on to articulate the terms of the judgment. I was hungry. You gave me food. I was thirsty. You gave me a drink. I was a stranger. You welcomed me. I was naked. You clothed me. I was in prison. You visited me. That's in verses 35 and 36. The I in every instance is the king. Every one of the yous is a plural pronoun. Again, this is a collective judgment. All these actions eventuated in being selected out as sheep. They supplied every need that the king had had. But this verdict, though surely welcomed, perplexed the sheep. The king was pronouncing the sheep as having acted righteously. Still, the sheep were confused. Why? It was simple. The sheep had not recalled doing any of these wonderful things to or for the king, and they said as much. Not only that, what the king said defies logic. What king goes hungry? What king is lacking for a drink of water? What king is unclothed? What king is a stranger? Finally, what king has to be visited in prison? All of these questions are absurdly rhetorical. No wonder the sheep are dumbfounded. Delighted as they might have been to be declared righteous and asked to stand by the king's right hand, the sheep simply do not understand what is taking place. Then the righteous who have been singled out as sheep ask a follow-up question, this time addressed to the Lord. When did we do these things to and for you, since we never recall having had any interaction with you at all? The king supplies an answer. Doing these acts of kindness and charity in behalf of the least of my brothers is the same as doing this to and for me. That's in verse 40. This begs another question. Precisely who are the least of these brothers? Since this is Jesus talking and setting the scene, his disciples readily come to mind as his brothers. Disciples typically have a fraternal relationship with a teacher or master. At the same time, while this interpretation is possible, it too stretches the imagination. Keep in mind, these are nations being judged. Nations would have had no more opportunity to act kindly and charitably with Jesus' disciples than they would have had with Jesus himself. Perhaps Jesus is regarding his brothers, as well as his sisters, as anyone who happened to be hungry, thirsty, naked, estranged, or imprisoned in the very nations being judged. These would constitute the least in need of such care. This would mean that righteous behavior was not the result of seeking out Jesus' disciples, but the result of meeting the needs of the hungry, thirsty, naked, estranged, and imprisoned wherever they happened to be. That would be a much larger group, and it would not require figuring out who Jesus' brothers and sisters were. We will come back to this issue. At this point, the king turns to those on his left side, namely the goats. He denounces them and relegates them to an eternal fire reserved for the devil and his messengers or angels. That's in verse 41. Normally, we associate this judgment with the idea of hell, though that term is not used here. Regardless, the punishment is dire. Why was such horrible punishment deserved? The king explains, I was hungry, but you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, but you gave me no water. I was estranged, but you did not welcome me. I was naked, but you provided me with no clothing. I was sick and in prison, but you never visited me. That's verses 42 and 43. Once again, the first person pronoun refers to the king, while all the second person pronouns are plural. As you might expect, the condemned protest because they are completely unaware of the neglect with which they have been charged. They ask desperately, again addressing the king as Lord, when it was that they saw him hungry but refused him food, or thirsty and did not bother to offer water, or saw him as a stranger but provided no hospitality, or realized he was naked but did nothing about it, or saw the king sick and in prison but made no attempt to visit him. That's in verse 44. The king's answer was parallel to the first one, only in reverse. Inasmuch as you did not do this for, or to, the least of these, this time around no brothers are mentioned, you did not do it to me. The king's verdict is final. The second group, the goats, will endure an eternity of punishment, whereas eternal life awaits the righteous. It turns out that this little vignette of a final judgment is not as straightforward as it appears. The judge, so to speak, is alternately referred to as the Son of Man, King, and Lord. Surely that identifies Jesus as the judge, primarily because of the Son of Man designation. At the same time, the judgment itself is adumbrated by prophetic material in which the nations submit to the sovereignty and ultimate judgment of Israel's God. This means that there appears to be little distinction between Jesus and the God of Israel as judge. As well, it is interesting that the sheep and goats are equally surprised by the verdict. The sheep cannot fathom their favorable judgment. The goats cannot fathom their unfavorable judgment. That is, no nation went into this judgment confident at the outcome. This should sober those who have historically viewed this judgment as an automatic endorsement of their own social gospel efforts. This is not a story that invites anyone to come into the court while saying, "Sheep here." At the same time, the criteria for judgment are manifestly what we sometimes call works. The judgment is based on behavior, not belief. What you believe about the Son of Man, the King, or the Lord seems not to count. How you treat the Son of Man, the King, the Lord, and those who represent him, doing to them is the same as doing to me, is decisive. On this latter point, it may be instructed to see this little parable as a riff on Ezekiel 34, in which the sheep are Israel and the shepherds are wicked Israelite kings. These kings do not take proper care of the sheep. These bad shepherds scatter the sheep, do not lead them into good pasture, do not bind them when they get crippled, or strengthen them when they become weak, or lead them to clean water, and the like. That is, the nations are being judged by the same criteria that are in effect for Israelites, even Israelite kings. Of course, these behaviors are replete in Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures, which Christians would later call the Old Testament. That is where one finds injunctions to take care of the widows and the orphans, show hospitality to the sojourner, not impose excessive interest when loaning money, making one's home available to the poor, and things like that. These remarks do not exhaust what needs to be said about such a sobering text. Other questions still remain. Have Christians slighted good works and overemphasized belief? Does this little vignette speak to the manner in which God will judge people unfamiliar with the gospel? How final is this judgment? What does this parable say about folk who believe rightly but have ignored the hungry, thirsty, the stranger, the naked, and those in prison? Why do we seldom hear about this from our pulpits? This is a hard text, indeed, very hard. I want to encourage you to go to my website, faspina.com, and let me know what your email is so that I can contact you when we get ready for our mini courses. If you have questions to ask me that you want me to address in another question and answer period, write me at fspina106@gmail.com. Thank you. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do 2 simple things. 1, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. 2, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.